Morning I signed the papers on a 4-bedroom house in Kelowna. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat on the back deck overlooking Okanagan Lake, and cried. Not because I was sad, because for the first time in 11 years, there was nobody in the world telling me I had failed. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not a man who was born with money. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the son of a nickel miner who worked 30 years underground and died with nothing but a pension that barely covered my mother's heating bills. I knew what it meant to count quarters. I knew what it meant to eat the same pot of soup 3 days in a row because you stretched it out and pretended it tasted different each time. I spent most of my working life in trades, plumbing specifically. I started as an apprentice at 19, got my red seal at 24, and by the time I was in my mid-40s, I had built a small but solid business. 4 trucks, 8 employees, commercial and residential contracts across northern Ontario. It wasn't glamorous. My knuckles were always cracked. My back ached by Thursday every week. But it was mine, every bit of it. My son was born when I was 31. His mother and I separated when he was 8, not bitterly, just honestly. We had married young and grown into different people. She moved to Barrie. He went back and forth. For most of his childhood, I thought we were close. I coached his hockey team 2 winters in a row. I drove him to his university interviews. I co-signed his first car loan. Then he met her. My daughter-in-law came into the picture when my son was 26. She was from money. Old Westmount money. The kind of family that had a second property in Tremblant and considered a Volvo wagon a modest choice. She was sharp, articulate, and from the very first dinner, she looked at me the way a person looks at a piece of furniture they plan to eventually put in storage. Within a year of the wedding, things had shifted. My son stopped calling as much. When I came down for a visit, she made a point of mentioning that they had a system in their home, and guests disrupted it. I stayed 2 nights and spent most of it in their guest room, listening to her speak about me in the next room, as though I couldn't hear through the wall. The word she used was rough, as in, his father is a bit rough. After that visit, I went back to Sudbury and told myself it would smooth out. People adjust. Marriages find their rhythm. I gave it time. What I did not expect was the letter. It came in February, just after Family Day weekend, which I found grimly appropriate. 2 pages, typed for my son. The gist of it was that my presence in their lives had become a source of tension, that he needed to protect his marriage and his future family, and that he thought it was best if we took some space. Indefinitely. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter for a long time. The furnace clicked on. The dog shifted on her bed in the corner. Outside, snow was coming down the way it does in northern Ontario in February. Heavy and indifferent, covering everything equally. I called him that night. He didn't pick up. I called the next morning. Same. I wrote back a handwritten letter, 3 pages, careful and measured. I never got a reply. That was 11 years ago. In those 11 years, I lost my mother to a stroke. I sold the plumbing business. Not because I had to, but because I was 60 and my back had finally said enough. I took the proceeds and, on the advice of a financial planner I'd been working with for years, put most of it into a mix of dividend ETFs and 2 small commercial properties in the Okanagan that a cousin had tipped me about when the market was still quiet. I wasn't trying to get rich. I was trying to stay busy and not think too much. The properties did better than anyone expected. The Okanagan was changing. Wine country had become something people actually moved to, not just visited. One of the properties tripled in value. The other I converted into a small retail unit and leased to a physiotherapy clinic. Between the rental income, the investment returns, and the proceeds from the business sale, I had done well, genuinely well. I bought the house in Kelowna, paid cash. I did not announce any of this. I am 63 years old, and I did not grow up in a world where you posted your bank statements on the internet. My neighbors knew me as the quiet guy with the vegetable garden who waved from the driveway. That was enough. Until September of last year. I was having lunch at a cafe in downtown Kelowna One of those places that does good borscht, run by a Ukrainian family who had been there since before the neighborhood got fashionable. When my phone buzzed. Unknown number, Quebec area code. I almost didn't answer. Dad. 11 years. His voice was the same and completely different. Lower. Tired in a way I didn't recognize. How did you get this number? I said. It wasn't a question, really. He said my cousin had passed it along. He said he was sorry to call out of the blue. He said things had been difficult and that he had been thinking about me. I sat with that for a moment. The woman at the next table was trying to keep her toddler from knocking over a glass of water. What do you need? I said. A pause. Then, we'd really love to see you, Dad. We thought maybe we could come out, visit for a bit. We. That word landed like a stone. I asked about my grandson. I didn't know much about him, just his name and age from a card my cousin had sent me years ago. He would be 14 now. My son said he was great, doing well in school, a good kid. Something in his voice changed slightly when he said it, a hesitation I couldn't quite place. I told him I would think about it and call him back. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat on the deck with a glass of Riesling from a vineyard down the road, and I thought about the letter. About February. About the dog who had since died, and my mother, and everything that had happened in 11 years that my son knew nothing about. I thought about how people change. I thought about whether the 63-year-old version of me owed anything to the 52-year-old version who had been cut off. In the end, I called my lawyer. His name is a detail I'll keep private, but he's been my lawyer for 22 years, and I trust him more than almost anyone I know. I told him the situation. He listened carefully. Then he said, "Just be careful, Bruce." My name is Bruce, by the way. I should have said that earlier. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late September, driving a BMW that had seen better days. A small crack in the front bumper, one of the back tires slightly low. The kind of things you notice when you used to work with your hands. My daughter-in-law was in the passenger seat. She got out first, looked up at the house, really looked at it in the way you assess something, and then smiled at me like we had seen each other last week. "Bruce," she said, and opened her arms. I let her hug me. I am not a man who makes scenes in driveways. My son shook my hand, and for a moment we just stood there, two men who shared genetics and 11 years of silence, neither of us sure what the correct gesture was. He looked tired. Older than his age in a way that suggested stress rather than wisdom. My grandson wasn't with him. I asked about that immediately. My daughter-in-law said he was with her sister for the week, getting some time with his cousins. She said it quickly and moved on before I could ask a follow-up. I showed them to the guest room. The house has 3 bedrooms, my room, the guest room, and a third I use as a home office. My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway of the guest room, nodded slowly, and then glanced at the office. "What's in there?" she asked. "My desk," I said, "my filing cabinet, my things." Another slow nod. "We might need more space if we're going to make this work long-term," she said. Not asked, said. I look at my son. He was looking at the floor. That evening I made a simple dinner. Roast chicken, roasted vegetables, a good loaf from the bakery on Bernard Avenue. I opened a bottle of wine. We sat at the kitchen table, and my son talked about how difficult things had been in Montreal. The cost of living, his job, which had changed 3 times in the past 4 years, the housing market. He said it with the tone of a man explaining a situation that wasn't his fault, which may have been true, but which also felt like a preamble to something. My daughter-in-law said very little during dinner. She ate carefully and watched the room the way people do when they're calculating. After dinner, when my son was washing up, she sat down across from me with a glass of wine and said, "We've been thinking that British Columbia might be a fresh start. The market is different here, and you have this beautiful space." I said, "This is my home." She said, "Of course, and family should be together." I said, "We weren't together for 11 years. The temperature in the room shifted slightly. She smiled again, that same smooth smile. That's exactly why we're here, Bruce, to fix that. I went to bed that night and lay awake listening to the lake. In the morning, I called my lawyer. What I had not mentioned to my son was that 3 weeks earlier, a former employee of mine, a young woman who had done some bookkeeping for the plumbing business, and who I had stayed in touch with over the years, had called me with something she felt I needed to know. She had a friend in Montreal who moved in some of the same circles as my son and daughter-in-law. Apparently, they had been in serious financial trouble for close to 2 years. 2 credit cards maxed, a line of credit they were struggling to service, and my daughter-in-law had, according to this account, told multiple people that she intended to get what was owed to her when it came to my estate. My grandson, that was the thing that kept circling back. On the second morning of the visit, I asked my son directly if he could bring my grandson out to Kelowna. I said I'd like to get to know him. My son said that was a great idea and that they'd organize something soon. My daughter-in-law from across the room said that might be complicated with his school schedule. I said, it's a long weekend in October. She said, we'd have to see. That afternoon when they had gone for a walk, I called my grandson's school. I know that sounds like something out of a film, but I had found the school name on a Christmas card my cousin had forwarded me years ago, and I had simply held on to the information the way I hold on to most things, quietly, in case it mattered someday. I spoke to the school office, identified myself as his grandfather, and asked if there was any way to pass along a message to have him call me. The woman who answered said she'd see what she could do. He called me that evening while my son and daughter-in-law were watching something on Netflix in the living room, and I was on the deck with my phone. His voice was quiet, careful, like he was checking the acoustics of a room before speaking. He said, "Grandpa?" I said, "Yeah, it's me." He said, "Mom said you didn't want to know us." I sat, very still. "That is not true," I said. "Not one word of that is true." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She said you cut Dad off because he married her." "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Do you feel safe where you are, at home?" A long pause. Then, carefully, "Things have been really tense. Dad and Mom fight a lot, about money mostly. She got really upset last month because Dad said he wanted to reach out to you, and she threw a plate. I asked him if there was a teacher or a counselor at school he trusted. He said there was a counselor, yes, that he'd talked to her a couple of times." I said, "Good. Keep talking to her. And I want you to know that I am here. I am not going anywhere." He said, "Okay, then are they there with you?" "Yes," I said. "Be careful," he said. My 14-year-old grandson told me to be careful. I held that for a long time after we hung up. The following day, I sat my son down while my daughter-in-law was at a yoga class she had found downtown. I told him I had spoken to his son. I watched his face move through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, discomfort, something close to shame. I said, "I sent you a letter, a handwritten letter. I called you. I tried." He said, "I know." I said, "Did you read it?" He looked at the lake. "She intercepted it," he said. "I found out a couple years later. By then I didn't know how to start. I want to say something about my son here. He is not an evil man. He is a weak one, which is perhaps harder to forgive because evil has the dignity of intention. Weakness is just a slow collapse. He had let a strong personality steer him somewhere he didn't want to go, and he had looked up one day and not recognized the view. I was angry. I am still angry. But anger and love are not mutually exclusive, and he is my son. I said, "I need you to do something for me. I need you to be honest with me about the money." And he was. All of it. The debt, the failed business venture his wife had pushed him into, the plan to move west, to stay here, and he couldn't quite say it, but I could hear it, find a way to access what I had built. I said, "And my grandson, what does he know about all this?" My son's jaw tightened. More than he should. She tells him things, uses him sometimes. He's a smart kid, Dad. Smarter than both of us. We sat with that for a while. My daughter-in-law came back from yoga and found the two of us at the kitchen table, She looked at the arrangement, the stillness of it, the empty coffee cups, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Good talk," she said brightly. I said, "Yes, why don't you sit down?" I had called my lawyer that morning. I had also called a family mediator, a woman whose name I found through the Law Society of BC, and made a preliminary inquiry. I had made notes. I had documentation from my former bookkeeper, time-stamped and forwarded to my email. I had a record of my grandson's own words, which I'd asked his permission to keep. I'm a man who spent 40 years in the trades. I learned early that the job you do before the job is the one that matters. Preparation. Measure twice. I told my daughter-in-law clearly and without drama that I was aware of their financial situation in detail, that I had documented the conversation with my grandson, and that if there was any suggestion of legal action around my estate or my assets, I had the resources to defend myself thoroughly and for as long as necessary. She started to speak. I continued. I told her that the guest room was available for 2 more nights, that my son was welcome to stay longer if he wanted to talk, alone, that I was going to be applying to the appropriate family services in Quebec to ensure my grandson had an independent advocate, and that I had already been in contact with his school counselor that morning, which was true. I had sent an email before she woke up. Then I told her that I had something for her and for my son. I put 2 envelopes on the table. My son's had a letter inside, something I had written the night before, and a check, not large, but enough to stabilize things for a few months, conditional on him engaging with a financial counselor whose details I had included, something to give him a floor to stand on, because I am his father and I am not interested in watching him drown. My daughter-in-law's envelope had a letter, no check. The letter said that I bore her no ill will, that I hoped she found stability, that she would not be welcome in my home going forward, but that I would not stand in the way of any healthy relationship she chose to maintain with her son. She read it in about 45 seconds. She put it down. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, not the smoothness, not the calculation, just something raw and a little lost. She said, "You can't do this." I said, "I already have." She left that afternoon. My son stayed 2 more days. We didn't talk about her much. We talked about his childhood, about hockey, about my mother, about a fishing trip we had taken when he was 12 to a lake north of Sudbury, where we caught nothing and it didn't matter. He cried once, briefly, and I put my hand on his shoulder and neither of us said anything. When he left, I shook his hand and then, because he is my son, and 11 years is a long time, I hugged him. He held on for a moment longer than I expected. He is back in Montreal now. He has been working with a financial counselor. He calls every Sunday, usually in the morning. We don't cover everything in one call, but we're covering ground. My grandson flew out in November for a long weekend. I picked him up at Kelowna Airport myself. He was tall, taller than I'd imagined from a name on a Christmas card, with his father's eyes and something steadier behind them. We drove along the lake road and he looked out the window at the water and said, "It's really beautiful here." I said, "Yeah, it grows on you." He said he wanted to study environmental science. He said he'd been reading about the water systems in the Okanagan for a school project and found them genuinely interesting. He asked if we could go for a hike. We went the next morning. Spent 3 hours on a trail above the lake. He asked good questions the whole way up. On the way down, he was quieter, the way people get when they're processing something large in a small space. At the trailhead, he said, "I'm glad you called the school." I said, "I'm glad they passed the message along." He said, "Dad talks about you more now." I said, "Good." He's booked to come back in March, spring break. He said he'd like to bring a friend. I said the guest room fits 2 if they don't mind the air mattress. I am 63 years old. I have a vegetable garden that is too ambitious for one person. I have a deck that faces a lake that turns copper in the evenings. I have a Sunday morning phone call I look forward to now, and a 14-year-old who sends me links to articles about wetlands ecology and signs them from your grandson, Theo. I don't know exactly what comes next. I'm not sure a man my age is supposed to. But I know this. The morning I signed those papers and sat on that deck and cried into my coffee, I thought I was crying because I had survived something. I didn't know yet that the thing I had survived was also making room, that all those years of silence had been, without my knowing it, a clearing. And that into a clearing, if you're patient, things eventually come. There's something I've been turning over since that weekend. Theo and I came down off that trail above the lake. He was quiet on the descent, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, it's full, and I kept thinking about how a 14-year-old had looked me in the eye over a phone and said, "Be careful," and meant it, and was right. I've lived long enough to understand that what happens to us is rarely random, not in any mystical sense. I'm not a man who leans on that kind of comfort. But in a practical, observable sense, the way we conduct ourselves over years accumulates into something. It becomes the ground beneath our feet, or the lack of it. My daughter-in-law spent 11 years building a version of events that suited her. She intercepted a letter. She told a child his grandfather didn't want him. She walked into a home she had no part in building and started measuring the rooms. And all of it, every small choice, was quietly compounding, the way debt does when you stop looking at the statements. And I was doing my own compounding without knowing it. I kept the plumbing business honest. I paid my employees on time, even in the slow winters. I showed up to my mother in her last years when it would have been easier to stay in Sudbury and feel sorry for myself. I didn't spend those 11 years bitter, because bitterness is expensive, and I was raised not to waste things. I stayed curious. I read. I invested carefully and asked questions I didn't know the answers to. I learned the Okanagan land market the same way I'd learned plumbing, methodically, from someone who knew more than me, with a lot of patience and a few early mistakes. None of that felt like preparation at the time. It just felt like getting on with it. But when my son called from that Quebec number, I wasn't a tired man scrambling to catch up. I was a man who had used 11 years well, and that made all the difference in how I handled what came next. I didn't react out of hurt. I thought. I called my lawyer before I called my emotions. I reached out to my grandson's school not out of spite but out of genuine concern, and I held whatever he told me with care because he was a child who had been put in the middle of something adults should have resolved. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Theo was sharp and steady and kind in ways that neither of his parents entirely modeled for him. He got there through something internal, some core of character that survived a difficult environment, the way a good tree grows around wire if it has to. He asked thoughtful questions on that hike. He sent me links to wetlands research with a sign-off that made me smile for the rest of the afternoon. That kind of person doesn't appear by accident. It takes something, a willingness to keep your integrity when the adults around you have misplaced theirs. I think about my son, too. He is not a villain in this story. He is a man who let someone else's certainty fill the space where his own judgment should have been. And he paid for that over a long, quiet decade. I gave him the check not as a reward, but as a floor, something solid to stand on while he figures out who he actually is, without someone else steering. Whether he uses it well is his work now, not mine. I sold the plumbing business when my back gave out, but the steadiness I built it with, the refusal to cut corners, the willingness to say I don't know, let me find out, the stubbornness that kept me getting up on the hard mornings, none of that went anywhere. It just changed shape. That's what I'd want anyone to take from any of this. Not that things work out. Sometimes they don't. But the choices you make quietly, in the years when nobody's watching, become the person who shows up when it matters. And that person either has something to work with, or they don't. Theo's coming back in March. I've already ordered a second air mattress.